This is Live Fire, with the latest news about threats to your liberties and your right to keep and bear arms. Our host is Larry Pratt, Executive Director of Gun Owners of America. Remember, the issue is not just about gun control. It's about control.
Good to be with you. Thanks for tuning in. This edition of the Gun Owners News Hour Live Fire going to be focusing on The Great Withdrawal, the title of a book by a friend of many years, Lowell Ponte. The subtitle explains what the withdrawal is, how the progressives' 100-year debasement of America and the dollar ends. It's a rather depressing cover that you put on the book, and that kind of gets folks started for what lies ahead. So I'm glad I'm a Christian and know that ultimately things will end well, but not necessarily in my lifetime. You start with a rather gripping quote from a German tourist. He came to Detroit to, quote, see the end of the world. Whoa. Lowell, what was he looking at?
Oh, well, he was looking at the end of workers' paradise. Detroit was supposed to be the example in the progressive movement of the political left. It was supposed to be the perfect city that the rest of the world would emulate, a city controlled by labor unions, by the left, by redistribution of wealth, and so on. And this is what it's turned into. Detroit, the largest city in the U.S. ever to declare bankruptcy. In fact, Mark Stein, the comic writer of great profundity, I might add, said that you look at Detroit today, 11 times more violent crime than New York City. The city is bankrupt. A third of the city is basically returning to wilderness, a land of burned houses, vacant lots, almost no humans living there. If you need the police or fire help, you call them, expect to wait at least an hour before they come. So if you can't defend yourself, well, the only good thing you can say about it is that when African-American Mayor Coleman Young took over and ran the city into the ground for 20 years, he did do one important thing, and that is he said, I'm not going to be like other liberal cities that disarm people. He was adamantly against gun control in Detroit.
You are correct. I remember that. A fellow from Detroit had actually had me come up to meet the mayor. I guess it was in our mutual benefit. Here's this right-wing gun crazy with an African-American mayor, and there's this, probably was a communist mayor.
I think, well, he was very much progressive and part of the old Progressive Party of 1848 movement that literally was either communist or very close to communism. But I think he understood, either consciously or unconsciously, that the first gun laws, the first gun control in this country was imposed to disarm black people.
And in fact, that was the conscious reason for gun control well up to the Second World War. I'm not sure liberals remember anymore their heritage, but then they've also forgotten that the Democrat Party was the spawning place of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, the Democratic Party was the party of the slave owners, of the Klan, of Jim Crow and Bull Connor, and they have carried out one of the most amazing con games in human history. I mean, to get 95% of African Americans to vote for the party of the slave owners and the Klan that is still using racial polarization, divide and conquer tactics to rule today. The only difference is now they favor different races, but the tactics are identical to what they used 200 years ago.
Well, and it's obviously a much less expensive, for the slave owner, form of slavery, because the 19th century slave owner had to provide room and board and everything for the slaves.
Food and so on.
Yeah, everything. Whereas
now
today,
they can pay you a pittance. In fact, American wages, when adjusted for inflation, haven't really gone up at all in the last 30-plus years.
In fact, I think it was in your book that I was reading that the value of our dollar today would buy you 2 cents at the turn of the last century.
But anyway, as we look at Detroit, here's what Mark Stein had to say, and we quote this in our book, The Great Debasement. No, pardon me, this book is The Great Withdrawal. Our previous book was The Great Debasement. Mark Stein, to achieve this level of devastation, you usually have to be invaded by a foreign power, he wrote. To any American time transported from the mid-20th century, were he to compare photographs of today's Hiroshima with today's Detroit, he would assume Japan won the Second World War after nuking Michigan. That's where progressivism leads.
I had occasion to spend a few hours in Frankfurt, Germany. I was on a layover, and I went through, I guess, what they would call the Old Town, and they had left part of it intact following World War II. It was rubble. There was nothing standing, nothing growing, still to this day. And then I had an occasion years ago when his friend drove me through Detroit to see, I thought I was back in Frankfurt, Germany. It's stunning to see miles of leveled houses, empty houses, nobody living in these vast urban deserts. Way to go, socialists. Sort of the opposite of the Midas touch.
Oh, absolutely. And, of course, that's a lot of what our book is about. We right now, Larry, are at the 100th anniversary of the first full-bore progressive government ruling us, and that was Woodrow Wilson, elected because the Republican Party split, and with a minority of the votes, Woodrow Wilson walked into the White House in 1913, and in that 1 year, they immediately implemented three terrifying things. They eliminated state legislatures being the ones to pick U.S. senators. They basically just turned senators into super congressmen with a fixed congressional district at the state borders. Number two, they implemented the progressive income tax, which Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto described as one of the 10 ways to destroy capitalism.
Right.
By the way, 9 of those 10 proposals of Karl Marx have been implemented by progressive governments over the last 100 years here.
In the United States.
And they created the Federal Reserve System. And if you read the first 2 paragraphs of the legislation enabling the Federal Reserve, it says their job is to furnish an elastic currency, which is to say, to begin getting rid of that old, nasty, gold-backed solid currency that the politicians, therefore, were not free to just print all they wanted of.
No more wiggle room if you have the gold standard.
And that, of course, was a key to being able to grow government to infinity, being able to just print all the money you need to do that, the way the Federal Reserve now prints out of thin air, like magicians, more than $1 trillion a year, and we accept that money, even though it's like accepting bank shares in an already bankrupt company.
Greece has shown how this is going to end.
Greece and Cyprus.
And Cyprus, yes. I guess even more. Yeah.
Well, most people don't understand, as the people on Cyprus learned, about a year ago, they learned the hard way that when you put your money in a bank, it is now understood legally in all Western nations what that means. In fact, the U.S. FDIC and the Bank of England issued a joint memo confirming that was their understanding, too. And that is, you think it's still your money, but it isn't. It is an unsecured loan that you have given to the bank. Once you lend them that money, it is their money. And all you have is a bank book saying if you're lucky, they'll pay you back with a pittance of interest.
And they can limit how much you can withdraw.
Well, they can indeed, and they are still doing that in Cyprus right now. The government in Cyprus just stepped in one day and confiscated everybody's bank account and said, we're now going to impose, in effect, a tax or a fee on all bank accounts. And the people had no legal recourse to do that.
I'm Larry Pratt of Gun Owners of America, and I want to invite you to join the Second Amendment movement with Gun Owners of America, the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. Take action by becoming a GOA member today by going to gunowners.org. Gun Owners members receive the GOA newsletter, fact sheets, alerts, certificates, and more. But there's more to joining GOA than just a list of member benefits. The united voice of GOA members has been successful in defeating restrictive legislation designed to disarm our population. GOA has helped get strong constitutional members of Congress like Senator Ted Cruz elected. And with your help, GOA will continue to successfully defend the rights of gun owners in the courts. Participate in our efforts to restore and preserve the nation's right to keep and bear arms. All contributions to our lobbying efforts are used exclusively to support or oppose firearms legislation. Join online at gunowners.org. Talking today with Lowell Ponte, written a number of books. The one we're talking about principally right now is The Great Withdrawal, and it's how the progressives have been stealing us blind and at the same time building a monumental government which is designed to have us do what we should have been doing all along, and now they're going to make very sure that we do what they want us to do. It's a really neat system, and
it's important, Larry, for people to understand that progressive is not just another word for liberal. You know, if you went back to the 19th century and you called someone a liberal, you were saying that they believed in small government, low taxes, leaving people alone, honoring individualism, and so on.
In other words, basically classical liberal now.
People who were called liberal then, today we call libertarians.
Okay, or libertarians.
Very, very different thing. In fact, a lot of libertarians call themselves 19th century liberals, just to annoy people on the political left. But that term was stolen, and when that term became unpopular, the left, Hillary Clinton in particular, took to calling themselves progressives. Progressives are not, by any stretch of imagination, advocates of freedom. What do they advocate? They come out of a European movement that was dedicated to collectivism, Darwinianism, romantic utopianism. The essence of the progressive is they believe that there really is no more God. God is passé. It's not chic to believe in God anymore. This is what the poet of that era, Matthew Arnold, was writing about in his poem Dover Beach. He was talking about you could hear the slow withdrawing roar of the tide of religious faith in the West as Europe, and basically the West in general, was moving toward atheism, at least everywhere except the United States. And what took its place was the utopian collectivist idea that if we just had a big enough government and a big enough power for science, that we'd be able to build our own utopia. That, okay, the universe is godless, but we, human beings, we will become God. We will make our own heaven on earth. This is what the socialists boasted of. And in Europe, that same view, that ideology, metastasized into communism and Nazism, both of which in their own odd ways were utopian movements.
And it's interesting that the socialists are not interested in an overly large pantheon for the gods. They want to make sure that as few people actually get the redistribution as possible so that they're able to live quite well, thank you very much, and the rest of us, well, we're all equal then. Isn't that a nice thing?
Sure. All animals are equal, wrote George Orwell in Animal Farm, but some animals are more equal than others. And those are the ruling elite who are smarter than the rest of us. You want to know what they look like in the U.S.? Imagine outgoing New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg. God help us. Here is a man who believes that he is a philosopher king in the tradition of Plato. He is superior to the rest of us. He will tell you that you can't have a glass of soda pop bigger than 16 ounces. He will tell you what you can eat, what you can drink, what you can say, what you can think. He will take New York City police and send them into gun stores in the Carolinas, in effect raiding the gun stores who have dared to sell weapons to people who later moved to New York. And that he was going to punish this somehow. In other words, this is a control freak. This is a nanny status. This is a megalomaniac. And that's what typical progressives are. Woodrow Wilson is exactly the same way 100 years ago.
That stunt of sending the cops into stores in another state where the cop has no jurisdiction. And if he had done that again, I was hoping that some of those police would have been put under arrest.
Well, they should have been.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, they were operating far outside their legal authority.
I mean, he gets used to it.
But you see, this is what progressives love to do because they're superior to you and me. They're smarter than we are. They know what's good for us, and it's not good for you to have guns or to have salt on your dinner table or to be able to drink more than 16 ounces of soda. And so they are going to control. They are the parents, and we are the children. That's what paternalism means from a progressive point of view. And you see this manifest in a whole lot of people. For Woodrow Wilson, part of that superiority involved his deep belief in eugenics. I mean, he signed criminal orders to have people who were criminals, who were mentally defective, as he saw it, and so on, sterilized, castrated, and so on. Now that, you would think, that kind of eugenic attitude that comes down to us through Margaret Sanger and into the birth control abortion movement today in the U.S., you would think that is no longer as chic as it used to be since Hitler was carrying out genocide against millions of people. But no, boys and girls. Barack Obama, one of the first things he did as president was to appoint as his science czar, as the man control. And remember, science is their god here, and the state is their god. His chief science advisor was John Holdren. Who is John Holdren? He's co-author of a book with Paul Ehrlich that openly advocated adding chemical sterilants to the world's water and food supplies, with government alone controlling the antidote. Meaning, if you wanted to have a baby, you would have to go hat in hand to a politician or a government bureaucrat and beg them for a little of the antidote so you and your wife could have a child.
You know, I think Americans would probably deal with that a little differently from the way they think.
Only if they're armed.
Uh-huh. That's kind of where I was going with that. Yes. Yes.
But understand, imagine another kind of progressive like Adolf Hitler, a European progressive, with that sort of power. I mean, all he'd need to do is put up on the bureaucrat's door, no Jews need apply. And denying that antidote to the Jews, in one generation, he has committed painless genocide against an entire group of people. Of course, today, on Barack Obama's door, that sign would read, no members of the Tea Party need apply.
Right.
No members of Gun Owners of America need apply. No people who are critical of our president and his progressive policies need apply. I mean, they've already used the IRS politically against the Tea Party.
And they've, as Janet Napolitano did, openly branded the Tea Party and pro-lifers and essentially all of the groups that had not been supportive of the president were the enemies. Were the enemy of the state. And everybody knows how you're supposed to deal with enemies, right?
Well, of course. And of course, they included basically anyone who was ex-military,
right?
Anyone, as you say, who was Second Amendment, all kinds of people.
Yep.
And of course, and since then, they have issued papers saying basically anyone who criticizes Barack Obama, they said this explicitly in that document, is to be viewed as a potential terrorist.
Yep.
As a racist fanatic and a potential terrorist.
So
just because you criticize him. Frankly, I want to say for the record, Larry, I don't oppose Barack Obama because he's a black. I oppose Barack Obama because he's a red.
Yes, that's the color that concerns me, too. He's basically trying to do to the country what his colleagues have done to Detroit. That's the fundamental transformation that lies ahead if we don't get a handle on this guy. And for that matter, the weenies in the Republican Party who seem to have in their DNA an ardent desire to give way to every demand made by one of these progressives.
Yes, Larry, when I was a callow youth and a very young journalist in Washington, D.C., eons ago, I lived on 2nd Street Southeast.
Wouldn't do that now.
Well, they have gentrified it, of course.
That's true.
But even so, I'd spent time hanging out with the now deceased Arthur Kroc. Now, Arthur Kroc was for 30 years chief of the New York Times Bureau in D.C.
I tell you what, let's return with Arthur Kroc after these messages, talking with Lowell Ponte about one of his books called The Great Withdrawal. Author Lowell Ponte and I are talking about how the progressives have, over a long march, a century-long march, perhaps we could argue even somewhat longer, have just tanked the United States. And I think it's becoming abundantly clear that it's not out of incompetence. Initially, I think even many conservatives thought that our incumbent president was just a stumblebum and a doofus. Well, even worse, he's neither a stumblebum nor a doofus. He's a very deliberate communist intent on fundamentally transforming this country, as he said. Now, we were talking about your roommate, author Arthur Kroc, when you were a young journalist. By the way, his name is not spelled with a C.
It's spelled with a K, very much so. By the way, am I the only person old enough to remember that your theme music is the theme from Peter Gunn,
Thank
the
you.
old TV show?
You are absolutely correct. You and I maybe...
Do I win the prize?
There was one other person, but I don't remember how long ago it was, who did identify the music. But it has a nice, energetic beat, and you're supposed to have that for a talk show.
So, and Peter Gunn is a wonderful double entendre. I love that.
Yeah, that was the...
But we won't go into that. It does have to do, though, with the same kind of complexity we put into our title of the current book, The Great Withdrawal.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear many things in that. It includes a withdrawal of bank accounts. It includes a withdrawal of, from the drug addiction of all this easy and free money that they keep printing out of thin air. And, of course, it even has sexual connotation, in that what the government has systematically done under progressivism is to make males extraneous, unnecessary. We now have a world in which the bureaucrats even have in their language the term GARS, G-A-R-S, in the welfare state. What GARS stands for is Government Assuming the Role of Spouse. And what that means is for 40% even of Caucasian women in the United States, they now have their babies out of wedlock. They are single mothers. And accordingly, they feel much more secure with the government there. You know, one of the guiding principles of progressivism at a political level is first we break your legs, then we offer you a crutch.
It's seemed to be working pretty well. It's
sure,
only
and
now.
then you are expected to be grateful for the crutch. The problem is many people don't even understand that it was government that broke your legs in the first place, that imposed taxes, regulations, and other problems on you so high that you could not take care of yourself.
Yeah, it's a lot.
You were a marginal person.
It's a lot less obvious that you're than breaking your leg. So maybe we'll need another kind of analogy, like putting you down with gas that you can't even smell. But whatever it is, yes.
Or as my wife likes to say, the government steals you blind, and then they won't give you a seeing eye dog unless you're obedient. That's another way to put it.
That's very good.
But we go into 250 pages of this in our book, The Great Withdrawal, the fourth in a 12-book series we're doing, to show people how they have been robbed, conned, manipulated, and how they can protect themselves.
Instead of saying thank you to the robber.
How we can even move back in the direction of the Constitution, the Republic, honest money, small government, and so on. And there is actually a serious chance we can succeed with that, because now the progressives are going into panic. They realize they're losing public support drastically. Even in a country where we only have 101 million with full-time jobs, but we have 108 million on welfare. Even in a country where 49.2% of households, essentially half of all households, now have somebody living there who gets a government check. I mean, we're at this dangerous tipping point. Yeah. By the way, if people want to get pencil and paper, we'll tell you before the show's over. We'll be happy to give 5,000 of your listeners, Larry, absolutely free and postpaid, a copy of The Great Withdrawal for the holiday season.
That is a fabulous offer.
This is a $20 book. This is, as I say, a 250-page book. This is not a pamphlet. And we'll cover all the expenses. It will not cost you a penny. All we will have to warn you, and this is required like a warning label, you read this, you'll never be able to view politics or economics quite the same way again, because you'll see just how manipulated it is. Now, I mentioned Arthur Kroc. I would hang out with him in his office. They still left him an office at the New York Times. It was significant that he was head of the New York Times bureau for 30 years in the Capitol, because that meant he knew where all the skeletons were buried on both sides. He knew all the dirt. And by the way, a paper like the New York Times or the Washington Post, they never publish all that they know. They always hold back information the way J. Edgar Hoover would at the FBI, so that if any politician dared to threaten them, they could say, oh, by the way, this is some of the other stuff we could drop about you, Congressman or Senator or Mr. President. And suddenly you would see the politician back off from what they were doing.
You know, that's one big reason why I'm pretty sure Ted Cruz is clean as a choir boy, because by now they would have run him through if they had anything on him. Instead, he's at home having devotions with his daughters every night, if he's not traveling anyway. And it's just a marvel to me that he really has to be clean as a whistle.
Well, this was eons ago, as I say, that I was hanging with Arthur Kroc, and one day we're alone in his office, still at the New York Times. He doesn't have a job there. They just let him have an office. And he turns to me and says, you know, Lowell, with the exception of my friend Barry Goldwater, I have never known a politician in this town, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, who would not sell his own mother in an instant in order to gain 5% more power or glory for himself.
I'm afraid
that was not coming from a drunk at the end of the local bar.
Right.
That was coming from a man who knew the dirt and the secrets about all those people of both parties, and he utterly despised them.
Yep.
Now, that's a proper attitude toward government, as even George Washington and Thomas Jefferson would have told you.
They sure did, too.
Well, this is the problem with what we call democracy. Number one, a lot of people can be bought. I mean, you remember Friedrich Bastiat, the French political philosopher, who said, government, at least in Europe at the time, and certainly here today, has become the great illusion by which everybody tries to live at the expense of everybody else.
Yep.
What we forget, said Bastiat, is government lives at the expense of all of us. And of course, George Bernard Shaw, who was himself a socialist playwright, people forget that, a proud enthusiast for the early Soviet Union, Shaw said, he who robs Peter to pay Paul can always count on Paul's support. That's what our politicians have found in this day and age.
And they do it with our money, so that they're actually using our money to fuel the war.
Oh, yeah, and what they do today, we outline what I call the 13 wars that progressives are constantly waging. They are fighting exactly the same way that in ancient Rome, the empire, as the British Empire later learned, you win by playing divide and conquer. You go into a country, you find out there are two tribes in the country, you deliberately manipulate your politics in order to keep them at each other's throats.
Right.
And once you do that, you don't have to fight them anymore. They're too busy fighting each other. So we now have a war between rich and poor. We have endless class warfare from Barack Obama. We have endless racial warfare. But you see, this is part of collectivism. The essence of being a progressive is people are not supposed to think of themselves as individuals uniquely created by God. The only God in the progressive pantheon is the state. Oh, by the way, the other day I did a column at Newsmax, where I'm a columnist, about a young woman who wrote an article in the left-wing webzine Slate. And it was a very poignant article. She said, I've got this young daughter. My husband wants her to know the magic of Santa Claus that he knew as a child. But Santa Claus is a lie. And I don't want to lie to my daughter. I wrote back and said, if you're that committed, then tell your daughter the whole truth. The whole truth is, number one, there really was a prototype of Santa Claus in a guy named St. Nicholas. He was a real person, a Christian saint, the Bishop of Myra, in what was then Greek territory but is now Turkey, who was famous for giving children gifts. You know, they would put out their shoes at night, and he would put coins in the shoes and so on. And he was a real person. However, the Santa today, that has nothing to do with Christianity, is in fact based on a lot of European paganism. He is not even a human. He's a jolly old elf. He, by the way, is politically incorrect, as we all have heard this discussion. I mean, he wears animal fur, he smokes, he's obese. In fact, that's part of the reason why Obamacare would kill Santa.
Yeah.
I mean, the death panels under Obamacare would say, you're really old, you're fat, you smoke, we won't give you medical treatment. Adios, Santa.
Let's come back to that happy thought about Santa and death panels. We were talking about Obamacare as we went into the break. And
and we were talking about Santa.
I wanted to just interject one thing that I had heard in a news report. A young lady, just as they were rolling out the Obamacare delight that we have been so marveled by, and she was quoted saying, I didn't realize I was going to have to pay for this. The larcenous little wench thought she was going to get something for nothing, and now that the trap has been sprung, she's not happy about it. Welcome to the club, honey.
Oh, yeah, and of course, part of the division we now see in society, as Steve Moore of the Wall Street Journal points out, is between the makers and the takers. And the politicians have tipped it so that there are now more takers than there are makers in the society. And that's a formula for doom in the long run. Because you're not going to be able to build a society. This is also the problem with socialism. You know, Margaret Thatcher was right. It works until you run out of other people's money.
Great.
And we're already so deep in debt, so far beyond other people's money. Oh, but as I was saying, there are fake Santas. One is the Santa of the commercial people who's utterly unreligious, who is out there telling you that you should spend your money, buy products, give them to your kids, how wonderful it'll be, but not a mention of Jesus, not a mention of Christ at Christmas. It's pure materialism, which is part of the progressive ideal. The other thing, even worse, is the fake Santa of politicians playing that they're Santa. This is what I called in my column the anti-Santa. Because not only does this fake Santa Claus, the politician who says, I can give you everything you want, I will pay for your life for you. Just become a dependent on government and vote for the big government party.
Of course, the one thing they're not going to give us is a gun.
No guns for Christmas.
You tied guns in a rather brilliant fashion to the main theme of your book. People buy guns in response to inflation. They buy it in response also to the perception of danger that the current president...
We do have to give Barack Obama credit for two things. Number one, he's been the most powerful gun salesman in American history.
Absolutely.
And number two, he's turned lead into the new precious metal.
Yep.
Into gold 2.0.
I have a bumper sticker I'm looking at that says lead, the other precious metal.
Yeah, and it is a precious metal that can save your life. Of course, if you're dealing with werewolves, you might prefer silver bullets. Or zombies, my friend.
It would become an exchangeable metal just like gold and silver in a time of real economic crisis.
Yeah, so much to say, so little time, and therefore we would love to just give a copy of this 250-page book to anyone in your audience who'd like it, basically. Just give us a toll-free call at 800-630-1494. We'll pay for the postage, we'll pay for the phone call, we'll pay for everything, just so that you can be given further ammunition, if you will, to fight back against the left and fight for the Republic. You will be glad you get this book, and as I say, it won't cost you a thing. It's our Christmas gift to you, just because Craig and I would like our children and grandchildren, like yours, to live in the America of the Constitution and the Founders, not that of the progressives. Two things in the book that people might find interesting. Pages 136 and 137, we talk about these four Democrat operative propagandists who put together an 80-page pamphlet on how to persuade people to support tougher gun control. And the essence of the pamphlet was this. They said, and I'm quoting, always focus on emotional and value-driven arguments about gun violence. Avoid discussions of the law, political differences, the Second Amendment, that might leave listeners feeling they know too little to make an informed anti-gun decision.
It's for the children.
Forget about rational debate. Forget about thinking logically. Just throw a pure emotional pitch at the animal side of the human brain, the side that can be herded like animals and driven off cliffs, the way the Indians did with buffaloes in the American plains. In other words, it's an outright appeal to be anti-rational, which is very progressive, but not at all what the Founders intended. The second thing, and by the way, we give people links to all these sources, so you can go read that 80-page book yourself, and you could see the video of this. This is what I particularly like. Eric Holder, what is the government really trying to do? Why do they have neuroscientists with a brain control office now in the White House? In 1995, as a U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., Eric Holder, in a speech before the Women's National Democratic Club, said he was announcing a campaign to, quote, really brainwash people into thinking about guns in a vastly different way.
Just as we did with tobacco.
Exactly like tobacco. And we give you a link so you can see the video on the Internet of him saying that yourself. He was on C-SPAN 2 when he said it. So here's an attorney general who openly says he's into brainwashing people about guns.
A little outside his job description, but hey, when you're a progressive, anything goes, right?
Well, that's the point. I mean, what matters is power, and however you get it doesn't matter. The important thing is that people like you be put in permanent control of people like Larry Pratt and Lowell Ponte.
In fact, some of them talk rather openly. The guy that actually wrote Obama's novel, I think it was, not really a biography, Bill Ayers has actually on the record said or written, I forget which, that it probably would be in this fundamental transformation of the country necessary to put those unreconstructables, such as ours truly, into concentration camps.
By the way, one of those who would be so put would probably be Jesus. And one of the many reasons that would happen, of course, is that Jesus advised his disciples to sell their cloaks and use the proceeds to buy a sword.
That's right. He wasn't going to be with them any longer to protect them, and it's a rough world out there, guys, so this is what I'm telling you.
So that was the equivalent in the year zero of saying, get a gun.
Probably getting a quote-unquote assault weapon, a semi-automatic rifle with a big old magazine.
And it is interesting that when Jesus was taken in the Garden of Gethsemane, what happened? The scriptures tell us Peter drew his sword and cut off somebody's ear. Boys and girls, in that day and time, they already had Roman gun control under Roman occupation. It was a crime for an ordinary person to have a sword.
So Peter was breaking the gun control laws of the day.
Yeah, the only people allowed to have such weapons were the guards of the Sanhedrin at the Jewish temple, by special dispensation and permission of the Roman emperor, or the procurator representing the Roman emperor there. So, no, ordinary people like Peter were not allowed to have swords, which is one of the reasons he had to flee from that scene rather quickly.
You had one very positive suggestion about the charter city, and I thought we ought to lay that out in the seconds remaining, that there is something we can be lobbying for.
Oh, certainly. In Detroit, as elsewhere, we can lobby to turn Detroit, or a part of the Detroit area, into the kind of place that Hong Kong or Singapore are now. That is, places of very low taxes, of free trade, and so on. Places where they may even have their own currency, such as gold-backed currency. And that would therefore create a hyper-free trade zone that would act like a vacuum, pulling in wealth from all over the world.
Well, not only then would they have to get rid of their taxes, but they'd also have to get rid of their gun control laws and other regulatory laws so that freedom could show what freedom can produce.
Well, I mean, what does it say about a government that it wants to disarm its people?
Right, who are theoretically the master of the government. When do we think highly of employees walking in and telling the boss, okay, this is the way it's going to be done? Really? Maybe you need to find a new boss because...
Yeah, well, I hope people will get the free book at 800-630-1494. And Larry, God bless you in this holy season.
Well, thank you so much for doing the show with me, my friend. I really appreciate you.
The Bill of Rights protects every American's God-given right to keep and bear arms. Now that right is being seriously undermined as legally registered rifles are being confiscated in some parts of our country. If we're not careful, we may find ourselves with no right to own guns, and that's where Gun Owners of America comes in. Gun Owners of America is in Washington every day fighting for you to keep that right. Congressman Ron Paul has called GOA the only no-compromise gun lobby in Washington. You need to be part of this great grassroots group of activists who are keeping the heat on their members of Congress. Find out right now how you can join. Call 888-886-GUNS and get started receiving their fact-filled newsletters and action alerts. Call 888-886-GUNS or go to their webpage at gunowners.org and help make your voice heard in Washington. Make that call right now and call Gun Owners of America at 888-886-GUNS. Remember, it's not just about gun control, it's about control.